to be. And I know things are super up in the air now that you and Haley, well, I was just calling to say that Zoe and I love your food. And like, of course, if one of you wanted to say just do it alone, or if it's too painful for both of you, we're in, Ainsley said. The bride-to-be, Lila, blinked. 3 mud spirits hung from the unmoving ceiling fan above her by their long, furling tails, so close that their bulbous noses detected the unfamiliar scent of lavender in Lila's brown hair. Humans, they'd discovered long ago, only worried about who or what was behind them and at their feet, axe murderers or palmetto bugs. They rarely looked up. Both of you? Lila said. You really don't... We committed to it, Ainsley said flatly, unless you found another caterer, which I'd understand since we sort of ghosted. No way, Lila lied, her voice going up. The spirits knew she and Zoe had discussed other options, but agreed to hold out a little longer, then doubled down. No, we wouldn't even dream of it. Oh my God, Ainsley, thank you so much. Sorry again, you guys. Don't mention it, Ainsley said, and it was unclear whether she referred to the thank you or the breakup, but the spirits were not convinced. When Haley and Ainsley had visited the home of the engaged couple a few months ago, the spirits had sniffed the trouble between them, but they could not come to a consensus about how to interfere before the, quote, lesbian food truck power couple, as Zoe called them, had left untouched by supernatural mischief. When the spirits learned through overheard phone calls that the tumultuous pair had agreed to cater the wedding on this land, all had been delighted at the opportunity for some excitement, then subsequently disappointed 2 weeks later to hear that the women had split up without supernatural interference. After this fateful afternoon phone call, however, the news that Haley and Ainsley planned to honor their commitment to work the wedding set the spirit world abuzz. They'd been forced to share their land with humans long enough to know how these things went, how the right sort of circumstance could force two horribly mismatched mates back into one another's arms. They were not about to let that happen, not on their land that had been theirs before ever there was a Lafayette, Louisiana. It was not, after all, Haley and Ainsley's first time breaking up. They still lived together. That night, the spirits of the air and land all met in what could only be described as a maelstrom high above the field behind Lila and Zoe's house, where the wedding would take place. They seldom met all together like this, as it posed too great a risk of being seen by day or catching an unsuspecting plane in the chaos of their congress by night, both of which would upset the natural order. The human eye would have seen a swirling, sparkling cloud of mud and leaves, water and fire, wind and grass, but the spirits sat serenely within an orb of glassy, obsidian-black walls, illuminated by eyes of the spirits of the flame, the glittering skin of the spirits of the stars, and the occasional crackling around the ever-shifting bodies of the spirits of the clouds. What follows is an approximation of the debate, as the spirits of the air and land, of course, would not communicate in anything resembling human speech. We are against all intervention, argued the only voice of dissent, the spirits of the flame. It would upset the balance. The hobgoblin spirits of the mud exchanged meaningful looks with the mutable spirits of the clouds, with whom they often worked in harmony. All present knew that the spirits of the flame opposed the extinguishing of anything resembling fire, even if the flame between such women as Haley and Ainsley would prove destructive in the end, perhaps especially in that case. And yet, said a glimmering purple representative from the spirits of the stars, surprising everyone, the spirits of the stars, keepers of harmony, seldom stepped in except to arbitrate. It was you who brought them together around a bonfire years ago, even though it was plain to all present they never would have come together. And what spirit of the air and land did not remember that day 1.5 years ago? How the spirits of flame, on a dare from the spirits of air, had infiltrated a bonfire in Lila and Zoe's yard to play a new dangerous game, kindle passion between the unlikeliest of lovers, and see how quickly it went up in flames. how incisive, introverted Haley had glared across the fire at the brash, gregarious 26-year-old Ainsley, 5 years Haley's junior, in rainbow platform boots and a bubblegum pink romper, who had, according to Lila's whisper earlier, gone, quote, from zero to full les after her first hookup with another woman just a few months earlier. How later, as ashes danced from the hypnotic glow of the remaining embers, Ainsley sat with uncharacteristic tranquility and asked Haley how long she'd been a sous chef, and she didn't talk over Haley even once, and Haley had wondered if she hadn't been wrong about this rainbow bright punk. How 6 months later, when the two first began fighting, they'd opened their food truck in hopes it would bring them closer and build trust between them. How it had accidentally built a cult following, particularly among the burgeoning Lafayette queer scene, but not the closeness or trust the two had intended. How even after their first breakup, it kept them in a feedback loop of on-again, off-again, business partners and sometimes lovers' state of limbo. How the aforementioned bride-to-be, Lila, a journalist and aspiring novelist, had remarked to her fiancé Zoe, without irony, that together the two were a forest on fire that didn't know how to put itself out, but they made a damned good vegan po' boy. Star-crossed, that's what they're calling it, continued the purple spirits of the stars, indignation deepening their dulcet tones. Do you know how insulting it is to hear humans say this on the land over which we shine each night? Do you know what else we heard? What else? What else we heard? Chimed the spirits of the water, who most closely resembled large silver salamanders, all overlapping one another in their pronouncements like the currents of a brook. Do you know what else we heard? Yes, we did. We heard them say, "This is blessed land." Blessed land. They said it was blessed land. Yes, and Haley and Ainsley met under some blessing. Yes, that's what they're saying. Yes, it is. Yes, yes, they said. And so, concluded the radiant purple spirit of the stars, their firm celestial voice acting as a dam to the overflowing proclamations of the spirits of the water, it is most urgent we undo this damage, lest the humans flood our small domain for blessings, lest they believe we would bless such an obviously doomed union. It would be a mockery of our power. Besides, said a representative of the spirits of the mud, daring to articulate what was on all the spirits' minds, who had been confined to a mere 50 acres of land, at the heart of which sat Zoe and Lila's little property, where Haley and Ainsley would cater their wedding. When's the last time we had any real fun? The spirits of flame yielded without another complaint, leading some spirits to wonder whether these agents of mischief and destruction hadn't set Haley and Ainsley's ill-fated relationship in motion for exactly this purpose. After all, they'd done nothing to encourage or discourage the union of the brides-to-be, reasoning that the two held a flame true enough they dared not interfere. However, none bothered to question them too closely, for all agreed the relationship must be stopped, for the good of Haley and Ainsley, for the restoration of the natural order, for the risk of cheapening the mystical reputation of their land, or simply for the allure of putting their underused talents towards some much-needed entertainment. Over the weeks leading up to the wedding, the spirits of the water dragged the runoff from heavy rains toward the ditch at the end of the property, a little at a time. They were careful not to make the whole property into a mire, working with the spirits of the mud and the clouds not to ruin the entire wedding. The brides, though less than the indigenous people who had once occupied the land, did make some effort to acknowledge the unseen forces around them. The spirits were not especially inclined to ruin their relationship. At the start of the big event, although Haley and Ainsley had shakily agreed not only to cater the wedding, but also to, quote, try things out one last time, a phrase they had used the last time they'd gotten back together, according to Lila's most recent sources of gossip, the spirits wondered how much incorporeal assistance Haley and Ainsley would really need to confirm that any relationship between them, romantic or business or otherwise, would be doomed to fail. It was perfect weather for a Louisiana spring. The spirits of the sunbeams and the air made sure it was neither too hot nor too windy, but instead pleasant warmth reigned while a mild, consistent breeze blew. However, this was largely where supernatural assistance ceased, at first, in the cultivation of the kind of day that would make any queer in their late 20s to early 30s seethe with envy. Lila and Zoe exchanged thoughtful and original vows beneath an enormous and wise-looking oak. In reality, the squat little golem-like spirits that inhabited it were more cunning than wise. The brides walked down the aisle toward the tree to a live, mellow synth-pop cover of Bjork's hyper ballad. Of course, the spirits knew who Bjork was and knew that the couple, like many other young, anxious queers, considered this to be their song. In lieu of a sermon, a friend of the brides gave a brief tribal history of the land upon which they stood. This was sacred land, the large man began, and the watching spirits bristled at the word was coming from this man who, for his apparent cultural awareness, still refused to see them. The reception took place beneath a large tent hung with string lights, just outside of which several rented consignment couches surrounded fire pits, in which later in the night the spirits of the flame would dance, licking occasionally at the hands of party guests too drunk to notice the blisters forming. In short, the spirits initially wondered whether, even without their intervention, there was any way Haley and Ainsley could witness such a majestic confluence of love and think their tense, passive-aggressive exchanges could ever hope to lead them to the same. Still, needful or not, the spirits intervened. Whereas the air outside Haley and Ainsley's food truck was crisp and breezy, the spirits of the air ensured no pleasant wind flowed through the open windows of the sweltering vessel. The spirits of the flame roared hot and unwieldy on the grills within, and the spirits of the sunbeams beat silently upon the shiny aluminum roof so that the tiny space felt all the more stifling. When either Haley or Ainsley left to refill buffet trays out in the breeze, each could not help but sigh at the relief of getting away from the other. Their food truck became a prison, and the already tense interactions between a broken up, then maybe back together couple working together in the supreme heat turned downright snappy. Outside, the happily wedded couple danced serenely to the tears and cheers of their loved ones. "White people dancing," remarked Ainsley with a cruel smirk at the bride, Lila, stumbling momentarily over her own feet on the spongy grass, Zoe catching her gallantly. "You know, criticizing other white people doesn't make you any less white," replied Haley, though the creases of the grin she tried to hide suggested that she'd been thinking it too. She flipped the rice on the griddle and said, almost as an afterthought, "It doesn't make you exempt from examining your own privilege either." The spirits of the mud, who clung to the windowsill outside of the food truck with tiny claws one would only see with a discriminating squint, snickered amongst themselves. They, too, had been playing their part, clinging to Haley and Ainsley's shoes. Though the ground was no wetter than usual for April in Lafayette, the wedding guests found their shoes surprisingly unsoiled, while the floor of the food truck was splotched with slippery earth. But the spirits of the mud would have their real moment soon. In the meantime, the spirits of the air delivered one swift, whooshing gust through the window that knocked the half-opened cayenne pepper into the bubbling pot of curried vegetables. The rush of air did not linger long enough to cool the cramped space. "Really?" Ainsley snapped at Haley, whose job it was to mix and watch the curry, and who had yelped at the spill. And yes, whom Ainsley clearly hadn't forgiven for criticizing her joke moments before. "It was the wind," moaned Haley helplessly, dumping their last can of coconut milk into the brew to offset the heap of spice that had sunken into the mix of swimming vegetables before it could be scooped out. This remaining can, it was clear, would not be enough to undo the damage. "And we just leave the lid off our spices now?" said Ainsley, not looking up from her chopping. Of course, it had been a web-like spirit of the grass that had crept up beside the spirits of the mud and curled one of its tendrils around the lid, twisting, while another spirit of the grass had held the container firmly in place with its own tendril. But since the lid had already fallen to the muddy floor where the spice jar had rolled from the windowsill to join it, the two women would never suspect divine intervention, even if they'd known how to look for it. Thus the rumblings began, even from the most gastronomically adventurous of the guests, that the curry was too spicy. Some who knew a thing or two about Haley and Ainsley's situation even giggled guiltily to themselves about the overspiced curry, giving variations on, "That's what you get when you hire a pair of fiery on-again, off-again lesbians to cater a wedding. They fight and they overspice the curry." One guest turned mock serious at the giggling and murmured that perhaps Haley and Ainsley had overspiced the curry in a small, bitter gesture of defiance at the newlywed couple's happiness. The married couple continued to dance, feeding one another dinner rolls, apparently unaware of the spice saga unfolding at the edge of their tent. It is a marvel what the right kind of wind can carry. The spirits of the air, always listening, snatched the juiciest tidbits of these hushed conversations and slithered as fast as striking cotton mouths toward the food truck windows. As the sun sank, doing nothing to mitigate the oppressive heat inside the traveling kitchen, the spirits of the air subjected Haley and Ainsley to snatches of conversation about their crumbling, yet again, relationship. A shame, they eventually heard Lila, of all people, replying to some busybody who was filling her in on the miserable state of the fallen from grace lesbian food truck power couple in their hot, slippery food truck. Fucking Lila, who had paused from dancing in her sweat-soaked wedding dress. But what must have stung most, the spirits agreed, was the sincerity in her voice. There was a hot minute there where we all thought they might, actually be happy together. They were kind of like heroes for me and Zoe when things got a little tough and we hadn't started therapy together yet. We were like, one day we're gonna grow up and be like Haley and Ainsley. Haley refused to look up from stirring frosting to accommodate the last-minute request for vegan cake for the half-dozen guests who had forgotten to fill out their dietary preferences on the RSVP letter. Haley and Ainsley both knew the hot minute Lila meant, and as it had happened on this land, the spirits did as well. The grand opening of their food truck had been on this very field, surrounded by what Ainsley had dubbed big gay love, the two working in perfect tandem, Ainsley's eccentric flavor fusions carried out by Haley's dexterous hand and chemist's eye for spice proportions. None of Haley's resentment for Ainsley carrying her, quote, kitchen dom energy into the bedroom had yet emerged, nor Ainsley's exasperation at Haley's tendency to stew for weeks on end without saying what was on her mind. The two had executed orders swiftly and flawlessly, pausing to peck one another on the cheek to the admiring eyes of their patrons and the suspicious gazes of the spirits of the air and land. The latter, of course, had recognized a performance when they'd seen one. Enough generations of tenants had rotted in front of the television on this land that the spirits had seen their share of sitcoms. Now, on Zoe and Lila's wedding day, the spirits of the flame could feel Haley burn with the weight of Ainsley's gaze behind her, both women screaming silently into the void. What happened to us? How did we fall so far? The pièce de résistance on the spirit's part, however, came when the growing shadows and dwindling guests indicated to Haley and Ainsley, who hardly spoke to one another at this point in anything beyond single-word grumbles, that they could collect their buffet trays and bow out. They had parked their food truck far enough from the tent that they could easily pull out, but heat exhaustion and the gathering dark, thickened immensely by the mouse-like spirits of the shadows, ensured that they missed one important detail. As they backed up to turn their truck toward the gravel road, it began to slide backwards faster, and even when Ainsley realized what was happening and shifted to drive, the spirits of the mud pulled with all their strength, and the spirits of the water added moisture from the readily nearby water table to make the ground all the more slippery, and the truck plopped itself firmly into the ditch, which had deepened over the weeks thanks to the spirits of the water and the mud and the clouds. The soft ground cushioned the impact, of course. The spirits did not aim to harm Haley and Ainsley. Quite the opposite. Guests gathered. Drunk men explained to Haley and Ainsley that if they turned the steering wheel just this far over and hit the gas just so, while John Mark and Polly G pushed just hard enough, they'd be on their way. Nothing worked. The aforementioned distant cousins stripped off their shoes and rolled up their suit pants, pushing and pushing. The shadows turned to total darkness, and the only light came from the tense string lights and the fire pits, where dancing or lounging guests pretended not to notice the calamity that had befallen the hired help, or convinced themselves that the small crowd around the truck had it covered. Ainsley called a tow truck. The concerned guests petered off. The drunk men lost interest, but not without each of them offering Haley his own inconsistently detailed, well-intended, but ultimately unsolicited suggestion for how Haley, the more butch of the two, and so in their eyes, presumably the more competent, might avoid this sort of predicament in the future. The spirits smiled among themselves. That is, until Haley and Ainsley, in spite of it all, found themselves waiting for the tow truck on an empty couch, damp with dew, beside a fire pit whose one wavering ember snuffed out the moment they sat before it, and they curled into the familiar warmth of one another's arms, more out of habit than affection. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Nobody understood what tribulations each had been through that evening better than the other. No guest occupied any of the other couches around that particular fire pit, nor attempted to revive its flame. None dared. The spirits of the air and the land and the mud and the shadows and the sky and the stars looked sadly at the neighboring fire, where the newlyweds shared whiskey and stories with their inner circle of remaining friends, then back at Haley and Ainsley, curled together on their lone couch, waiting for the tow truck, apparently closer than ever, in spite of all the signs of doom the spirits had worked so hard to orchestrate. Well, the spirits had hoped not to spoil the newlyweds' night, but it had to be done. Plump clouds had gathered in case of this very emergency, and perhaps the married couple at least would see it as a happy omen. The spirits of the air and the land and the mud and the shadows and the sky and the stars nodded in a symphony of silent agreement, turning their full attention to Haley and Ainsley. It began to rain. Thank you. I think there's a little bit of time for questions, but we certainly don't have to do that. Thanks for coming.
You gonna do an audiobook?
I did, in fact, and I do have little downloads of the audiobook for sale if anybody's interested. I narrated it myself a little more energetically than I managed to read tonight, but yeah, I got my publisher basically to sign the audiobook rights to me, because I was like, I do theater and, I've done voiceover stuff for work, so I was like, it makes sense. So yeah, I recorded one. It's not on Audible yet or any of that. I just didn't have time, and also wanted it to be kind of a live event exclusive until after the book tour. But yeah, I did.
Right. Nice.
Yeah, any other questions? I don't know.
When did you write that story?
Okay, so this story of the air and land I wrote in 2019. It was actually after a really good friend of mine's wedding, not a lesbian couple. It was a queer wedding, but I don't know the exact situation of the people who catered the wedding, but basically I heard tell that it was basically a lesbian couple that had broken up a bunch of times. So this is the one story in here that a lot of what's in it actually happened in real life, with obviously some details kind of exaggerated for the story, and of course all of the spirits and creatures and everything. But it was one of those things where the wedding really was the most beautiful day, but if you kept your eye on what was happening with the food truck people, the food truck really did fall into a ditch, and they really did have a bunch of people try to help them, and it was all a bunch of my friends' cousins who were giving them all this very unhelpful advice, and it was kind of very sad to watch, but it was also a little bit slapstick and funny. So my friend who got married, who by the way has since gotten divorced, was like, oh, you have to, because it was somebody that I met through my MFA program, who was in the nonfiction program, and was like, this friend and another one of my friends who was a poet was like, someone's got to write something about this, and it has to be someone that writes fiction, because like you can't make a lot of this stuff up that happened. So yeah, that one was in 2019, and it's actually one of the latest ones that was in the collection. This story and the last story are in 2019. A lot of them I've written kind of over time, over the last 10 years. So like, to give you an idea of how long a book takes to publish, the last story of this was written in 2019. I compiled these stories into something resembling a short story manuscript in like 2020, 2021, and then started submitting it in late 2021 and signed the contract in early 2022. So like, it really does take a very long time. And that's, I mean, is from contract to release, like a pretty standard turnaround is like a year to a year and a half, especially with small presses.
So where do you get other ideas besides some real life situations that you can turn into a story? Like, what's your idea process?
Yeah, I just I have a weird overactive imagination is a big part of it. But I do, when I have more time and bandwidth and I'm not rushing around, I do try to remember my dreams, and if there's anything interesting going on in my dreams, sometimes I have like very vivid and kind of absurd dreams, and I'll get inspiration from that. Sometimes it's from stuff that actually happens, or sometimes I mean, I just surround myself with weird people who say weird things, and sometimes somebody will say something weird and I'll like jot it down, and it'll become, there are a few things in here where I'm like, man, some of my friends that read this are gonna see just like a little piece of something they said warped into something really bizarre and grotesque. I had to have that conversation with a friend about one story, kind of the most grotesque story in the collection is called The Color of Cream, which family advisory, you probably don't want to read that one. It's about a guy who's sort of late in life discovers his sexuality while he's like already married and deep into middle age, and he sort of like discovers dormant feelings while he's like watching a very androgynous television psychic that he's obsessed with. But the thing that I took from a friend who told me this story, a couple friends who used to do this when they were kids, is that a couple of my friends were like, oh yeah, when I was a kid, instead of having like cereal, I would like fill a bowl with just croutons and sometimes put dressing on them, sometimes not. And it was just like so bizarre that I had that image in my head, and this guy in this story, they didn't have any weird like buried sexuality feelings or anything. That was all my own creation. But I had that image in my head of like somebody eating croutons while watching TV and being weird and like secretive about it. So through the piece, while he's watching the psychic and eating the croutons, he's like, his wife is asleep, and like he reflects on sort of like his wife hates that he eats these croutons. She's like very disgusted by it, and he like has to hide it from her, and it becomes this kind of metaphor for his like very buried sexuality. Again, family, please skip it. I'll tell you which ones you should skip. This is one of them. It gets very grotesque. But so like little things like that, or like things that happen where just there's this little image or snapshot, and I'm like, what if something really weird happened here, or like or you're in a group of people and something strange is happening, and I very often get self-conscious and think like, what would somebody observing this from outside say about what's going on here? So kind of all over the place. Dreams, weird stuff people tell me. I'm very into like, researching like esoterica and stuff like that, so that provides some inspiration as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the story that you just read, you seem to like all the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any you disliked? Because you speak so comfortably about all of them.
Yeah, so, I think like, maybe I'm pontificating a little bit here, but I feel like a writer's job is to even characters who make decisions that you don't agree with or cause a lot of harm, I really feel like a writer's job is to try to figure out why somebody would do something like that, or why somebody would do the things that they do. And a lot of the pieces in this collection, I think, explore kind of why people make decisions that seem very obviously self-destructive from the outside. So there are certainly some characters. There's one character in The Oak I Knew, which is the second to last story, who's sort of more obviously a villain. His name is Uncle M. It's sort of a play on Auntie M from The Wizard of Oz, because there's a sort of like leaving the bubble kind of, tone to that story. But like there's a character in that story who is supposed to be very obviously not likable. There are a couple of cartoonishly kind of not likable characters in here. But I would say in this collection, like even the most despicable characters, I try to give kind of a driving, motivating force. Mask for Mask, which is another one of like the raunchier ones. That one's a little more family friendly. There's sex in it, but it's described in kind of a cartoonish, funny way. But that one is like about a guy who becomes an older man who becomes able to transform into like young, attractive men, and he like goes on a total sex rampage of like cheating on his husband, and it's sort of about like, I don't know, fidelity and anonymity and things like that. But that character, even though he is like represents a lot of things that I don't like, I try to tell it from his perspective and kind of sympathize with him and understand like what would motivate people to do something like that, and like what they might be going through or working through inside themselves. So I do try very hard to sympathize with all the characters. There are some that are, obviously kind of, you're supposed to not like them, but I try not to do that too much. I think a lot of writers will be like, this character is very unlikable and possesses an ideology that I very obviously want you to disagree with. And like, I try to avoid doing too much of that, I think.
When you write some of your stories, do you know how it's going to end before you start writing it? Or does it evolve? Or sometimes you know what the ending is and then you have to evolve what happened to get there?
Yeah, sometimes I absolutely do. Like, obviously, Of the Air and Land,
Yeah.
the piece that I just read, I knew how that ended, because really the falling
Sure.
into the ditch as this like orchestrated
Right.
signal of doom. But for pieces like, for a lot of them, no, and for a lot of them, I really I get a lot of feedback from old colleagues, and a lot of these stories I worked on in like MFA workshops. So like if I get feedback that an ending isn't working, like I will completely change it. Like if unanimously people are like, this is not working, and they provide very persuasive reasons that it's not, like I will completely revamp it. I mean, Borealis and Mask for Mask, which are sort of the two longest stories in the collection, I have probably changed the ending a number of times.
Mm-hmm.
Mask for Mask, I didn't really figure out what the ending was until my kind of last round of major revisions with my editor. And that was like, I wrote an entirely new, like 5 pages of text for it. So the short answer is sometimes yes, a lot of the time no, especially the longer that a piece is, the less likely I am to have determined how it's supposed to end. But I like to try different things out, I have a pretty strong instinct about like ending lines. I feel like I'm pretty good at ending lines, and I can get kind of attached to them, but I don't get so attached to any idea that I can't throw it away, Well, thanks everyone. Are there any more questions?